Welcome everyone. This is Samsara Audio. I'm Matthew. I'm ripping a page out of my friend's Theory Underground's book and doing a live reading of an important text. So I'm currently working on a seminar coming out in March called The Violence of Care, Inquiry into Bureaucratic Power, and I'm kind of using that as a pilot for a larger course that I'd like to launch later in the year on what I'm currently calling critical bureaucratic studies. A central text that I'm going to be working from in this course, which has some important ideas that I think really orient us in the field, is the final chapter in Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1. It's called Part 5, Right of Death and Power Over Life. This model of right of death and power over life, this distinction, these two opposed regimes of power, provide a framework for us to understand how power has changed and how it operates differently in our present context. So, okay, let me zoom in a little bit. I feel like the text is really small. Great. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to read the text and I'll comment along the way what is coming up for me as I read it. So here we go. This is part 5, the last chapter of Foucault's History of Sexuality, Volume 1. For a long time, one of the characteristic privileges of sovereign power was the right to decide life and death. In a formal sense, it derived, no doubt, from the ancient patria potestas that granted the father of the Roman family the right to dispose of the life of his children and his slaves. Just as he had given them life, so he could take it away. By the time the right of life and death was framed by the classical theoreticians, it was in a considerably diminished form. It was no longer considered that this power of the sovereign over his subjects could be exercised in an absolute and unconditional way, but only in cases where the sovereign's very existence was in jeopardy, a sort of right of rejoinder. If he were threatened by external enemies who sought to overthrow him or contest his rights, he could then legitimately wage war, require his subjects to take part in the defense of the state. Without directly proposing their death, he was empowered to expose their life. In this sense, he wielded an indirect power over them of life and death. But if someone dared to rise up against him and transgress his laws, then he could exercise a direct power over the offender's life. As punishment, the latter would be put to death. Viewed in this way, the power of life and death was not an absolute privilege, it was conditioned by the defense of the sovereign and his own survival. Must we follow Hobbes in seeing it as the transfer to the prince of the natural right possessed by every individual to defend his life, even if this meant the death of others? Or should it be regarded as a specific right that was manifested with the formation of that new juridical being, the sovereign? In any case, in its modern form, relative and limited, as in its ancient and absolute form, the right of life and death is a dissymmetrical one. The sovereign exercised his right of life only by exercising his right to kill, or by refraining from killing. He evidenced his power over life only through the death he was capable of requiring. The right which was formulated as the power of life and death was in reality the right to take life or let live. Its symbol, after all, was the sword. Perhaps this juridical form must be referred to a historical type of society in which power was exercised mainly as a means of deduction, a subtraction mechanism, a right to appropriate a portion of the wealth, a tax of products, goods, and services, labor and blood levied on the subjects. Power in this instance was essentially a right of seizure of things, times, bodies, and ultimately life itself. It culminated in the privilege to seize hold of life in order to suppress it. So what Foucault is describing in this first paragraph is an older model of power. And he talks about sort of this absolute right that the patria of the father of the Roman family had, where he had this complete indiscriminate right to do whatever he wanted with his family because they were essentially his property. Now later on, that power has, as he points out, diminished, it's deteriorated, and it comes down to the king or the lord now is able to exercise this right to either take life or to allow somebody to live, but only in relation to whether the king is directly threatened or his laws are being transgressed. So he doesn't have absolute impunity. There is some realization that there's a principle that the king can only act in this way on the basis of whether he for some sort of reason, whereas the Roman father didn't need to even have a reason necessarily to act in the way that he did. Um, but what Foucault wants us to see is that this power, this way of exercising power, is he calls it a subtraction mechanism. So it's the right to appropriate or take or seize things. There's the subject, and the sovereign has the right to just take things from them by virtue of being the sovereign. Let's hold this model of power in mind, and we're going to keep going. And Foucault is going to talk about what he thinks is a newer model that is starting to emerge. Um, Also, I want to comment and apologize that I've had a cold going on for like 3 weeks now, so I definitely don't sound up to my usual self. Um, since the classical age, the West has undergone a very profound transformation of these mechanisms of power. Deduction has tended to be no longer the major form of power, but merely one element among others, working to incite, reinforce, control, monitor, optimize, and organize the forces under it. A power bent on generating forces, making them grow, ordering them, rather than one dedicated to impeding them, making them submit, or destroying them. There has been a parallel shift in the right of death, or at least a tendency to align itself with the exigencies of a life administrating power and to define itself accordingly. This death that was based on the right of the sovereign is now manifested as simply the reverse of the right of the social body to ensure, maintain, or develop its life. Did you notice that? He says that the sovereign's right to be able to protect himself has been inverted. Now it's been reversed into a right of the social body to ensure and maintain or develop its own life. So there's an interesting shift that's taking place away from the powers to force submission or to destroy or to subtract, and now towards the generation and management of force and energy and flow within the social body. Yet wars were never as bloody as they have been since the 19th century. And all things, here we go, all things being equal, never before did regimes visit such holocausts on their own populations. But this formidable power of death, and this is perhaps what accounts for part of its force and the cynicism with which it has so greatly expanded its limits, now presents itself as the counterpart of a power that exerts a positive influence on life, that endeavors to administer, optimize, and multiply it, subjecting it to precise controls and comprehensive regulations. Wars are no longer waged in the name of a sovereign who must be defended. They are waged on behalf of the existence of everyone. Entire populations are mobilized for the purpose of wholesale slaughter in the name of life necessity. Massacres have become vital. It is as managers of life and survival, of bodies and the race, that so many regimes have been able to wage so many wars, causing so many men to be killed. And through a turn that closes the circle, as the technology of wars has caused them to tend increasingly toward all-out destruction, the decision that initiates them and the one that terminates them are in fact increasingly informed by the naked question of survival. The atomic situation is now at the endpoint of this process. The power to expose a whole population to death is the underside of the power to guarantee an individual's continued existence. The principle underlying the tactics of battle, that one has to be capable of killing in order to go on living, has become the principle that defines the strategy of states. But the existence in question is no longer the juridical existence of sovereignty. At stake is the biological existence of a population. So what he's saying is that, notice this distinction here, this move from the sovereign to a population. The population as a biological set of living human beings. The survival of this population, the care and the management The multiplication of this population is now what must be protected and prolonged through the exercise of violence. If genocide is indeed the dream of modern powers, this is not because of a recent return of the ancient right to kill. It is because power is situated and exercised at the level of life, the species, the race, and the large-scale phenomena of population. As a side note, Foucault is making an argument here about why the greatest slaughter in human history has happened during the modern period. It's not just that we have more um, mechanistic, machine-like weapons. It's not simply that we have better machinery to be able to do it. In fact, it was the will of the state to grow and protect the population which seized upon scientific technique to produce these weapons. But it's fundamentally the drive not to protect the sovereign, his body or his power, his state or his rights, but the need to prolong and to care for the population that is able to produce these mass slaughter events like World War I, like the Holocaust, like World War II. Of course, even when we think about the gulags in the USSR. So um, there's this fundamental shift from the sovereign individual, who's the Lord, who exercises their right to take things and to enrich themselves and to protect themselves through killing or letting live, to a state which takes responsibility for managing and prolonging the life of a population. It says, on another level, I might have taken up the example of the death penalty. Together with war, it was for a long time the other form of the right of the sword. It constituted the reply of the sovereign to those who attacked his will, his law, or his person. Those who died on the scaffold became fewer and fewer, in contrast to those who died in wars. But it was for the same reasons that the latter became more numerous, and the former more and more rare. As soon as power gave itself the function of administering life, its reasons for being and the logic of its exercise, and not the awakening of humanitarian feelings, made it more and more difficult to apply the death penalty. This I want to zero in on this phrase, the administering of life, its reason for being, the logic of its exercise. Foucault's going to focus on how death becomes this mysterious point where the administration of life, the state that now exercises this power over life, is sort of fascinated and fails to understand death. It sees death as the point where it breaks down, and this is why capital punishment goes away, is because the state that administers life has this dream of rehabilitating the criminal rather than punishing the criminal. How could power exercise its highest prerogatives by putting people to death when its main role was to ensure, sustain, and multiply life, to put this life in order? For such a power, execution was at the same time a limit, a scandal, and a contradiction. Hence, capital punishment could not be maintained except by invoking less the enormity of the crime itself than the monstrosity of the criminal, his incorrigibility, and the safeguard of society. One had the right to kill those who represented a kind of biological danger to others. One might say that the ancient right to take life or let live was replaced by a power to foster life or disallow it to the point of death. This is perhaps what explains that disqualification of death, which marks the recent waning of the rituals that accompanied it. That death is so carefully evaded is linked less to a new anxiety which makes death unbearable for our societies, than to the fact that the procedures of power have not ceased to turn away from death. In the passage from this world to the other, death was the manner in which terrestrial sovereignty was relieved by another, singularly more powerful sovereignty. The pageantry that surrounded it was in the category of political ceremony. Now it is over life, throughout its unfolding, that power establishes its dominion. Death is power's limit, the moment that escapes it. Death becomes the most secret aspect of existence, the most private. It is not surprising that suicide, once a crime, since it was a way to usurp the power of death, which the sovereign alone, whether the one here below or the Lord above, had the right to exercise, became in the course of the 19th century one of the first conducts to enter into the sphere of sociological analysis. It testified to the individual and private right to die at the borders and in the interstices of power that was exercised over life. This determination to die, strange and yet so persistent and constant in its manifestations, and consequently so difficult to explain as being due to particular circumstances or individual accidents, was one of the first astonishments of a society in which political power had assigned itself the task of administering life. Well, we know that Emile Durkheim, who is generally considered one of, if not the father of sociology, one of his very earliest works is a study of suicide. I think this is what Foucault is probably alluding to. He's pointing out that this new discipline of sociology which emerged, one of its first points of occupation and fascination was with this decision for people to kill themselves. The moment where people bring about their own death because power is fixated by this moment that is mysterious to it, because it no longer takes death as the point where it exercises power, but rather because power takes itself to be the administration of life, death becomes this mysterious point of its failure, and this is why it becomes fascinated by this particular moment. So in concrete terms, starting in the 17th century, this power over life evolved in two basic forms. These forms were not antithetical, however. They constituted rather two poles of development linked together by a whole intermediary cluster of relations. One of these poles, the first to be formed, it seems, centered on the body as a machine. Its disciplining, the optimization of its capabilities, the extortion of its forces, the parallel increase of its usefulness and its docility, its integration into systems of efficient economic controls, all this was ensured by the procedures of power that characterized the disciplines and anatomopolitics of the human body. The second, formed somewhat later, focused on the species body, the body imbued with the mechanics of life, and serving as the basis of biological processes, propagation, births and mortality, the level of health, life expectancy, and longevity, with all the conditions that can cause these to vary. Their supervision was effected through an entire series of interventions and regulatory controls, a biopolitics of the population. The disciplines of the body and the regulations of the population constituted the two poles around which the organization of power over life was deployed. Emphasize that the disciplines of the body, number one, and two, the regulations of the population, constituted the two poles around which the organization of power over life was deployed. This setting up in the course of the classical age of this great bipolar technology, anatomic and biological, individualizing and specifying, directed toward the performance of the body with attention to the processes of life, characterized the power whose highest function was perhaps no longer to kill, but to invest life through and through. The old power of death that symbolized sovereign power was now carefully supplanted by the administration of bodies and the calculated management of life. During the classical period, there was a rapid development of various disciplines: universities, secondary schools, barracks, workshops. There was also the emergence in the field of political practices and economic observation of the problems of birth rate, longevity, public health, housing, and migration. Hence, there was an explosion of numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies and the control of populations, marking the beginning of an era of biopower. I just want to stop and highlight these things. The problems of birth rate, longevity, public health, housing, and migration. All of these problems emerge from a shift in perspective. When we move from the idea of thinking about an individual human's birth to a set of humans understood as a population as having a certain generalized rate at which births take place, that's the emergence of birth rate as a problem and as a measure, But it requires this shift from the idea of an individual birth as a unique or idiosyncratic moment to that event as a data point in a larger data set of events which are like it and are now included as a single set which can be analyzed from many different perspectives. This birth is no longer the birth of you or the birth of me, but it is now a birth in relation to every other birth which took place within the population. They've been sort of reduced to each other and can now be analyzed within a single data set. And that's how these problems of longevity, public health, housing, and migration no longer is one person um, moving from one country to another because of their circumstances and the specific circumstances in the place they're going and their hopes and their dreams about where they're going. Now that movement from one place to another is now a part of this general concept of migration, of the inflow into a territory and the outflow from a territory. So back to the text. Hence, there was an explosion of numerous and diverse techniques for achieving the subjugation of bodies and the control of populations, marking the beginning of an era of biopower. Biopower here is Foucault's term that I think is very helpful, and we'll just keep it in mind. Hopefully, you've heard it before, but hopefully, what we've read so far has brought more clarity to what that might mean. The two directions taken by its development still appear to be clearly separate in the 18th century. With regard to discipline, this development was embodied in institutions such as the army and the schools, and in reflection on tactics, apprenticeship, education, and the nature of societies, ranging from the strictly military analyses of Marshal de Saxe to the political reveries of Gibert or Servan. As for population controls, one notes the emergence of demography, the evaluation of the relationship between resources and inhabitants, the construction of tables analyzing wealth and its circulation, the work of Quesnay, Moreau, Soumich, the philosophy of the ideologist as a theory of ideas, science, and the individual genesis of sensations, but also a theory of the social composition of interests. Ideology being a doctrine of apprenticeship, but also a doctrine of contracts and the regulated formation of the social body, no doubt constituted the abstract discourse in which one sought to coordinate these two techniques of power in order to construct a general theory of it. In point of fact, however, they were not to be joined at the level of a speculative discourse, but in the form of concrete arrangements that would go to make up the great technology of power in the 19th century. The deployment of sexuality would be one of them, and one of the most important. I will get into this more, but of course this is Foucault's history of sexuality. I will tie this back eventually to this theory that Foucault is developing. How does it relate specifically to the history of sexuality, and why does he bring it up in this book? So, this biopower was without question an indispensable element in the development of capitalism. This is interesting. The latter would not have been possible without the controlled insertion of bodies into the machinery of production and the adjustment of the phenomena of population to economic processes. But this was not all it required. It also needed the growth of both of these factors, their reinforcement as well as their availability and docility. It had to have methods of power capable of optimizing forces, aptitudes, and life in general, without at the same time making them more difficult to govern. I just want to note here that it sounds to me like Foucault is saying the administration of life, which first developed, became a tool in the hand of the capitalist system to produce for itself a population of labor power. The role of the administration of life is the cultivation of what we might call human capital, human resources, because the vital energy of life, the health and the vitality of each individual person is what the capitalist machine has to feed off of. And therefore, the new forms of power which administrate and manage and invest in life are necessary in order to continue to keep the machine running because they maintain the standing reserve of labor power that the capitalist system can draw upon. If the development of the great instruments of the state as institutions of power ensured the maintenance of production relations, the rudiments of anatomo and biopolitics created in the 18th century as techniques of power present at every level of the social body and utilized by very diverse institutions: the family, the army, schools and the police, individual medicine, and the administration of collective bodies, operated in the sphere of economic processes, their development, and the forces working to sustain them. They also acted as factors of segregation and social hierarchization, exerting their influence on the respective forces of both these movements, guaranteeing relations of domination and effects of hegemony. The adjustment of the accumulation of men to that of capital, the joining of the growth of human groups to the expansion of productive forces, and the differential allocation of profit were made possible in part by the exercise of biopower in its many forms and modes of application. The investment of the body, its valorization, and the distributive management of its forces were at the time indispensable. It's funny how he describes it here in this last paragraph, or this last sentence here: the investment of the body, its valorization, a very technical financial term, and the distributive management of its forces. Uh, he's talking about life and the forces of the body as capital that has to be invested in, maintained, and eventually its value will be valorized within the economic sphere. One knows how many times the question has been raised concerning the role of an ascetic morality in the first formation of capitalism. But what occurred in the 18th century in some Western countries, an event bound up with the development of capitalism, was a different phenomenon, having perhaps a wider impact than the new morality. This was nothing less than the entry of life into history. That is, the entry of phenomena peculiar to the life of the human species into the order of knowledge and power, into the sphere of political techniques. Foucault is saying here that the idea of humanity as a species, as a population of animals with forces and energies and life and attributes and biological processes, this notion first enters into history in, he says, the 18th century in some Western countries. This is what he means by the entry of life into history. Life being the biological existence of human beings as a population of creatures. It is not a question of claiming that this was the moment when the first contact between life and history was brought about, he says, to clarify an obvious misunderstanding. On the contrary, the pressure exerted by the biological on the history had remained very strong for thousands of years. Epidemics and famines were two great dramatic forms of this relationship that was always dominated by the menace of death. But through a circular process, the economic and primarily agricultural development of the 18th century, and an increase in productivity and resources even more rapid than the demographic growth it encouraged, allowed a measure of relief from these profound threats. Despite some renewed outbreaks, the period of great ravages from starvation and plague had come to a close before the French Revolution. Death was ceasing to torment life so directly. But at the same time, the development of the different fields of knowledge concerned with life in general, the improvement of agricultural techniques, and the observations and measures relative to man's life and survival contributed to this relaxation. A relative control over life averted some of the imminent risks of death. In the space for movement thus conquered, in broadening and organizing that space, methods of power knowledge assume responsibility for the life processes and undertook to control and modify them. So he's saying basically that in the past, the biological effect upon groups of humans was primarily seen from the angle of the threat that nature presented through the form of either famine, so not enough food, or plague, the outbreak of disease. But because human beings were able to start producing food at larger scales. And he doesn't mention this, but obviously some new medical advancements and sanitation technologies are developed around this time. We He's basically saying we got enough of a foothold to where we could hold these things at bay, where we started to begin to think about, okay, well, we're not just sort of on our back foot all the time anymore. Now we can actually think about how could we optimize life's processes rather than constantly be fending off nature's threat of killing us. So for the first time in history, no doubt biological existence was reflected in political existence. The fact of living was no longer an inaccessible substrate that only emerged from time to time amid the randomness of death and its fatality. Part of it passed into knowledge's field of control and power's sphere of intervention. See, this is great. This life is being turned into a predictable phenomena which can be objectified, studied, analyzed, and this is how it passes into knowledge's field of control. And by becoming an object of knowledge, it then becomes a domain where power can begin to intervene. Only once it becomes an object of knowledge can power act upon life, whereas before life was this seemingly random, contingent, mysterious thing that came and went, subject to forces that we didn't understand. Power would no longer be dealing simply with legal subjects over whom the ultimate dominion was death, but with living beings, and the mastery of it would be able to exercise over them would have to be applied at the level of life itself. It was the taking charge of life, more than the threat of death, that gave power its access even to the body. That's a good line. It was the taking charge of life, more than the threat of death, that gave power its access even to the body. If one can apply the term biohistory to the pressures through which the movements of life and the processes of history interfere with one another, one would have to speak of biopower to designate what brought life and its mechanisms into the realm of explicit calculations and made knowledge power an agent of transformation of human life. It is not that life has been totally integrated into techniques that govern and administer it. It constantly escapes them. Outside the Western world, famine exists on a greater scale than ever, and the biological risks confronting the species are perhaps greater and certainly more serious than before the birth of microbiology. But what might be called a society's threshold of modernity has been reached when the life of the species is wagered on its political strategies. For millennia, man remained what he was for Aristotle, a living animal, with the additional capacity for a political existence. Modern man is an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. I want to reflect on that for a little bit, but it's also feeling so dense that I don't know where to start. I feel that the urgency of our time, like there's a sense in which politics feels so urgent. It feels that so much is on the line. I think we feel so polarized precisely for this point that it's now no longer whether power has the ability to take things from us, even up to the point of death. It's that politics has shifted from that model to our life being at stake. Is the life not just of us individually as well, but as a human species is constantly at stake in our political activity. Some people would point to, say, the climate change crisis for this, that our actions, which we have permitted, are contributing to massive environmental change, which in turn shifts where we put our resources, how we live our day-to-day lives, migration, it touches everything. You could also look at Foucault sort of mentions this, that the biological risks confronting the species are perhaps greater and certainly more serious than before the birth of microbiology. I mean, he's certainly right. We're doing, say, gain of function research on diseases to make them even more deadly. We're making deadly diseases in laboratories that very intentionally. So in some way, our political strategies, one, we're engaging in these strategies to be able to, say, counter our enemies and to understand how these diseases work better. But at the same time, we've also put our entire existence as a species on the line by creating new and unimaginable threats that didn't exist before. There's more to say there, but I do want to keep going. This transformation, he said, had considerable consequences. It would serve no purpose here to dwell on the rupture that occurred then in the pattern of scientific discourse and on the manner in which the twofold problematic of life and man disrupted and redistributed the order of the classical episteme. If the question of man was raised, insofar as he was a specific living being and specifically related to the other living beings, the reason for this is to be sought in the new mode of relation between history and life, in this dual position of life that placed it at the same time outside history, in its biological environment, and inside human historicity, penetrated by the latter's technique of knowledge and power. There is no need either to lay further stress on the proliferation of political technologies that ensued, investing the body, health, modes of existence and habitation, living conditions, the whole space of existence. Another consequence of this development of biopower was the growing importance assumed by the action of the norm at the expense of the juridical system of the law. Law cannot help but be armed, and its arm, par excellence, is death. To those who transgress it, it replies, at least as a last resort, with that absolute menace. The law always refers to the sword, but a power whose task is to take charge of life needs continuous regulatory and corrective mechanisms. It is no longer a matter of bringing death into play in the field of sovereignty, but of distributing the living in the domain of value and utility. There's so much there. You can see how power today no longer operates in this mode of the law is there to impose some sort of violent punishment. But what we see is a continual investment in developing mechanisms for regulation and correction. I think about how in the final days of his presidency, Joe Biden has been commuting sentences for, I believe, upwards of 50 people on death row. Um, he, he's saying that as a Catholic, he finds the death penalty to be reprehensible. Of course, that's not the historical view of the Catholic Church, but that's also a digression. Um, but the point is that, as Foucault pointed out earlier, the death penalty has not gone out of style because of some deep humanitarian feelings about things, but rather that there's been a move in power's operation towards regulation, correction, and rehabilitation. And this is what he's pointing out. And I really like how he points out that the main goal of power today is to distribute the living in the domain of value and utility. Um, Power now concerns those questions where it didn't concern itself with those questions prior. Such a power has to qualify, measure, appraise, and hierarchize rather than display itself in its murderous splendor. So we've moved from the splendor of the spectacle, which imposes fear and causes one to submit, and we've moved towards power as that which quantifies, measures, appraises the value, it orders things in their relations. It does not have to draw the line that separates the enemies of the sovereign from his obedient subjects. It affects distributions around the norm. So this is a funny thing that he's pointing out, that there's not exactly enemies within the biopolitical society. There's only um, distributions along which people are more likely to be friendly or less likely to be friendly to the regime. So, for instance, you have domestic terrorists. And these people they're not exactly enemies of the state. They're understood instead as people who need to be watched and surveilled because they display marks that indicate higher statistical probabilities of carrying out acts of terrorism. So these people are not enemies of the state, rather, they display marks that have been statistically determined to make them more probable to act in certain ways. Of course, then we have individuals like the accused Luigi Mangione, who didn't seem to offer any of those marks and yet engaged in an act of domestic terrorism. So you've got these, um, as Foucault points out, distributions around the norm, but of course there's always these strange deviations from the norm too. So I do not mean to say that the law fades into the background or that the institutions of justice tend to disappear, but rather that the law operates more and more as a norm, and that the judicial institution is increasingly incorporated into a continuum of apparatuses whose functions are for the most part regulatory. So his point here is that now the hospital and the clinic are the first step along the journey, along the juridical journey. So think of the image of the at-risk youth. The at-risk youth, they are not an accused criminal, and they are not being sent directly to, say, juvenile hall for correction and rehabilitation. But the first step is a school counselor who meets with them and wants to understand their feelings, their personal circumstances, what their home life is like, and then maybe they're suicidal, and so then the counselor deems it necessary to call a 5150, and they need to spend 72 hours in a psychiatric lockup for their own safety. This continuum, you start out uh, in the clinic, you start out in the hospital, you start out in the counselor's office, you start out at the social services um, agency looking for resources about housing. These are sort of like the foothills that one arrives at that are now in this continuous relationship with the judicial system. And you've got the psychiatrist who sits on the stand in the courtroom and whose testimony holds legal weight, talking about this person that they've evaluated or that they've been working with for a long time, providing context, that sort of thing. Maybe there's a diagnosis. So he shows how these regulatory apparatuses are integrated into the judicial system now, which speaks to a fundamental change in what the judicial system is there for and what its aims are. So a normalizing society is the historical outcome of a technology of power centered on life. So a normalizing society, not a juridical, not a law society, a normalizing society, um, which is a society of averages, of the mean, of statistics, and of quantification, of norms and deviations. We have entered a phase of juridical regression in comparison with the pre-17th century societies we are acquainted with. We should not be deceived by all the constitutions framed throughout the world since the French Revolution, the codes written and revised, a whole continual and clamorous legislative activity. These were the forms that made an essentially normalizing power acceptable. Moreover, against this power, that was still new in the 19th century, the forces that resisted relied for support on the very thing it invested, that is, on life and man as a living being. Since the last century, the great struggles that have challenged the general system of power were not guided by the belief in a return to former rights, or by the age-old dream of a cycle of time or a golden age. One no longer aspired toward the coming of the Emperor of the Poor, or the kingdom of the latter days, or even the restoration of our imagined ancestral rights. What was demanded, and what served as an objective, was life, understood as the basic needs, man's concrete essence, the realization of his potential, a plenitude of the possible. Whether or not it was utopia that was wanted is of little importance. What we have seen has been a very real process of struggle. Life, as a political object, was in a sense taken at face value and turned back against the system that was bent on controlling it. It was life more than the law that became the issue of political struggles. even if the latter were formulated through affirmations concerning rights. This is really fascinating because what Foucault is saying here is that people stopped demanding a righteous king. They stopped demanding the coming of a lawgiver who would set things right. And they instead started to demand life. They demanded to be given life rather than the process of political struggle being around more just laws and the just application of those laws. Um, it was life more than the law that became the issue of political struggles. The right to life, to one's body, to health, to happiness, to the satisfaction of needs, and beyond all the oppressions or alienations, the right to rediscover what one is and all that one can be. This right, which the classical juridical system was utterly incapable of comprehending, was the political response to all these new procedures of power, which did not derive either from the traditional right of sovereignty. So Foucault is saying that we can see this shift in power even in the people's demand, which is being made of power. The people's demand has shifted to one which the older system literally couldn't comprehend. Instead, the demand is now to receive what is one's right, which is life, bodily health, happiness, and the satisfaction of needs, and even to have one's full potential realized. That this is somehow the sovereign's responsibility and your due that they ought to give you. So this is where Foucault makes a shift, and he's going to start bringing this back around to why is he talking about this in the history of sexuality. Well, this is the background that enables us to understand the importance assumed by sex as a political issue. It was at the pivot of the two axes along which developed the entire political technology of life. On the one hand, it was tied to the disciplines of the body, the harnessing, intensification, and distribution of forces, the adjustment and economy of energies. On the other hand, it was applied to the regulation of populations, through all the far-reaching effects of its activity. It fitted in both categories at once, giving rise to infinitesimal surveillances, permanent controls, extremely meticulous orderings of space, indeterminate medical or psychological examinations, to an entire micropower concerned with the body. But it gave rise as well to comprehensive measures, statistical assessments, and interventions aimed at the entire social body, or at groups taken as a whole. Sex was a means of access both to the life of the body and the life of the species. This makes sense, after all. Sex is this not only something deeply personal, but it is also the production of the species. It was employed as a standard for the disciplines and as a basis for regulations. This is why in the 19th century, sexuality was sought out in the smallest details of individual existence. It was tracked down in behavior, pursued in dreams. There's a little dig at Freud. It was suspected of underlying the least follies. It was traced back into the earliest years of childhood. Freud again. It became the stamp of individuality. At the same time, what enabled one to analyze the latter and what made it possible to master it. But one also sees it becoming the theme of political operations, economic interventions, either through the incitements to or curbs on procreation, and ideological campaigns for raising standards of morality and responsibility. It was put forward as the index of a society's strength, revealing of its political energy and its biological vigor. Spread out from one pole to the other of this technology of sex was a whole series of different tactics that combined in varying proportions the objective of disciplining the body and that of regulating populations. Whence the importance of the four great lines of attack along which the politics of sex advanced for 2 centuries. Each one was a way of combining disciplinary techniques with regulative methods. The first two rested on the requirements of regulation, on a whole thematic of the species, descent, and collective welfare. In order to obtain results at the level of discipline, the sexualization of children was accomplished in the form of a campaign for the health of the race. Precocious sexuality was presented from the 18th century to the end of the 19th as an epidemic menace that risked compromising not only the future health of adults, but the future of entire society and species. the hysterization of women, which involved a thorough medicalization of their bodies and their sex. Again, this is David Freud, who worked with women diagnosed as hysterics first and foremost. Responsibility they owed to the health of their children, the solidity of the family institution, and the safeguarding of society. It was the reverse relationship that applied in the case of birth controls and the psychiatrization of perversions. Here the intervention was regulatory in nature, but it had to rely on the demand for individual discipline and constraints. Broadly speaking, at the juncture of the body and the population, sex became a crucial target of a power organized around the management of life rather than the menace of death. What Foucault's basically saying here is that sex was the perfect starting point for this shift in power because sex is right where the two things meet of the discipline of the body and the regulation of the population. Because sex is both something one does with their body, it is an action, it has biological functions, there are diseases, there are techniques, everything associated with it, but it's also the production and management of the species itself. And so we see that sex is the locus where these two lines intersect so clearly and vividly that this is where power began its work. The blood relation long remained an important element in the mechanisms of power, its manifestation, and its rituals. For a society in which the systems of alliance, the political form of the sovereign, the differentiation into orders and castes, and the value of descent lines were predominant. For a society in which famine, epidemics, and violence made death imminent, blood constituted one of the fundamental values. It owed its high value at the time to its instrumental role, the ability to shed blood, to the way it functioned in the order of signs, to have a certain blood, to be of the same blood, to be prepared to risk one's blood, and also to its precariousness. It's easily spilled, subject to drying up, too readily mixed, capable of being quickly corrupted. A society of blood, I was tempted to say of sanguinity, where power spoke through blood. The honor of war, the fear of famine, the triumph of death, the sovereign with his sword, executioners and torturers. Blood was a reality with a symbolic function. We, on the other hand, are in a society of sex, or rather a society with a sexuality. The mechanisms of power are addressed to the body, to life, to what causes it to proliferate, to what reinforces the species, its stamina, its ability to dominate, or its capacity for being used. Through the themes of health, progeny, race, the future of the species, the vitality of the social body, power spoke of sexuality and to sexuality. The latter was not a mark or a symbol. It was an object and a target. Foucault's pointing out the difference here, these symbols of blood versus sex. The older society of the rite of death was focused on blood, and blood was a material reality with a symbolic function. However, we now live in a society of sex, where power addresses itself not to this symbolic function of blood, but directly to the materiality of bodies and the vital forces of life that are at work in those bodies. He says that sex is an object and a target. It's not a reality with a symbolic function, like in older societies. So, moreover, its importance was due less to its rarity or its precariousness than to its insistence, its insidious presence, the fact that it was everywhere an object of incitement and fear at the same time. Power delineated it, aroused it, and employed it as the proliferating meaning that had always to be taken control of again, lest it escape. It was an effect with a meaning value. Okay, so we have a material reality with a symbolic function versus an effect with a meaning value. I do not mean to say that a substitution of sex for blood was by itself responsible for all the transformations that marked the threshold of our modernity. It is not the soul of two civilizations or the organizing principle of two cultural forms that I am attempting to express. I am looking for the reasons for which sexuality, far from being repressed in the society of that period, on the contrary, was constantly aroused. The new procedures of power that were devised during the classical age and employed in the 19th century were what caused our societies to go from a symbolics of blood to an analytics of sexuality. Clearly, nothing was more on the side of the law, death, transgression, the symbolic, and sovereignty than blood, just as sexuality was on the side of the norm, knowledge, life, meaning, the disciplines, and regulations. Marquis de Sade and the first eugenicists were contemporary with this transition from sanguinity to sexuality. But whereas the first dreams of the perfecting of the species inclined the whole problem toward an extremely exacting administration of sex, the art of determining good marriages, of inducing desired fertilities, of ensuring the health and longevity of children, and while the new concept of race tended to obliterate the aristocratic particularities of blood, retaining only the controllable effects of sex, Sade carried the exhaustive analysis of sex into the mechanisms of the old power of sovereignty, and endowed it with the ancient but fully maintained prestige of blood. The latter flowed through the whole dimension of pleasure, the blood of torture and absolute power, the blood of the caste, which was respected in itself and which nonetheless was made to flow in the major rituals. Of parricide and incest, the blood of the people, which was shed unreservedly, since the sort that flowed in its veins was not even deserving of a name. In Sade, sex is without any norm or intrinsic rule that might be formulated from its own nature, but it is subject to the unrestricted law of power, which itself knows no other law than its own. If by chance it is at times forced to accept the order of progressions carefully disciplined into successive days, this exercise carries it to a point where it is no longer anything but a unique and naked sovereignty, an unlimited right of all-powerful monstrosity. While it is true that the analytics of sexuality and the symbolics of blood were grounded at first in two very distinct regimes of power, in actual fact, the passage from one to the other did not come about without overlappings, interactions, and echoes. In different ways, the preoccupation with blood and the law has for nearly 2 centuries haunted the administration of sexuality. So just to make a point here, Foucault is getting into how he's describing a transition between two things: the society of blood, society of sex, the symbolics of blood, and the analytic of sexuality. I mean, he's saying that there's not a clean break. There's not like a clear threshold between these two things, but rather that to some extent we can trace the echoes and continued operations of this older regime of power within the current one. So he's just making that point. Two of these interfaces are noteworthy, the one for its historical importance, the other for the problems it poses. So he's going to point out some examples of kind of where these echoes kind of continue to cling on, or there's been a transformation. So beginning the second half of the 19th century, the thematics of blood was sometimes called on to lend its entire historical weight towards revitalizing the type of political power that was exercised through the device of sexuality. And racism took shape at this point. Racism in its modern biologizing status form, which he's distinguishing from the ever-present discrimination between groups that takes place in human history. It was then that a whole politics of settlement, family, marriage, education, social hierarchization, and property, accompanied by a long series of permanent interventions at the level of the body, conduct, health, and everyday life, received their color and their justification from the mythical concern with protecting the purity of the blood and ensuring the triumph of the race. Nazism was doubtless the most cunning and the most naive, and the former because of the latter, combination of the fantasies of blood and the paroxysms of a disciplinary power. A eugenic ordering of society with all that implied in the way of extension and intensification of micropowers in the guise of an unrestricted state control was accompanied by the oneric exaltation, oneric referring to dreams, of a superior blood. The latter implied both the systematic genocide of others and the risk of exposing oneself to a total sacrifice. It is an irony of history that the Hitlerite politics of sex remained an insignificant practice, while the bloodbath was transformed into the greatest bloodbath in recent memory. At the opposite extreme, starting from the same end of the 19th century, we can trace the theoretical effort to reinscribe the thematic of sexuality in the system of law, the symbolic order and sovereignty. It is to the political credit of psychoanalysis, or at least of what was more coherent in it, that is regarded with suspicion, and this from its inception, that is, from the moment it broke away from the neuropsychiatry of degenerescence. The irrevocably proliferating aspects which might be contained in this power mechanisms aimed at controlling and administering the everyday life of sexuality. Whence the Freudian endeavor, out of reaction no doubt to the great surge of racism that was contemporary with it, to ground sexuality in the law of alliance, tabooed consanguinity, and the sovereign father. In short, to surround desire with all the trappings of the old order of power. It was owing to this that psychoanalysis was, in the main, with a few exceptions, in theoretical and practical opposition to fascism. But this position of psychoanalysis was tied to a specific historical conjuncture. And yet, to conceive the category of the sexual in terms of the law, death, blood, and sovereignty, whatever the references to Sade and Bataille, and however one might gauge their subversive influence, is, in the last analysis, a historical retroversion. We must conceptualize the deployment of sexuality on the basis of the techniques of power that are contemporary with it. This section right here deserves a lot of discussion, a lot of investigation. Foucault is coming out swinging against psychoanalysis here, saying that it is an attempt to return sexuality back to a context of the symbolics of blood, of law, sovereignty, the image of Oedipus. To put sexuality under the banner of Oedipus is to revert from an analytics of sexuality to a symbolics of blood. To try to bring sexuality back into the older form of power. But he says we must conceptualize the deployment of sexuality on the basis of the techniques of power that are contemporary with it. So what Foucault is implying here is that psychoanalytic theory at the time was not thinking about sex and sexuality from within the current framework of how power is addressing and intervening with and making sense of sexuality. What it thinks it's doing is not really what it's doing. It thinks that it's drawing out sexuality and it's reconceptualizing it within an older frame. But as it draws sexuality out, it puts bodies and sex at the disposal of power to make sense of them in its own way. So in some way, psychoanalysis is kind of this useful, naive tool that doesn't realize it's being used by power. Now that's also my gloss from other places in Foucault, but I think you can see that in this. Would love to come back to this sometime. I think we should, should chat about it with some other people, but we're getting near the end and I want to keep pushing through. So people are going to say that I am dealing in a historicism which is more careless than radical, that I am evading the biological established existence of sexual functions for the benefit of phenomena that are variable, perhaps, but fragile, secondary, and ultimately superficial, and that I speak of sexuality as if sex did not exist. And one would be entitled to object as follows. You claim to analyze in detail the processes by which women's bodies, the lives of children, family relations, and an entire network of social relations were sexualized. You wish to describe that great awakening of sexual concern since the 18th century and our growing eagerness to suspect the presence of sex in everything. Let us admit as much, and suppose that the mechanisms of power were in fact used to arouse and excite sexuality, then to repress it. But here you remain quite near to the thing you no doubt believe you have gotten away from. At bottom, when you point out phenomena of diffusion, anchorage, and fixation of sexuality, you are trying to reveal what might be called the organization of erotic zones in the social body. It may well be the case that you have done nothing more then transposed to the level of diffuse processes mechanisms which psychoanalysis has identified with precision at the level of the individual. But you pass over the thing on the basis of which this sexualization was able to develop, and which psychoanalysis does not fail to recognize, namely, sex. Before Freud, one sought to localize sexuality as closely as possible. In sex, in its reproductive functions, and its immediate anatomical localizations, one fell back upon a biological minimum, organ, instinct, and finality. You, on the other hand, are in a symmetrical and inverse position. For you, there remain only groundless effects, ramifications without root, a sexuality without sex. What is this, if not castration, once again? Now, this whole sort of long objection is kind of the too clever for their own good psychoanalyst who is objecting that Foucault has basically subtracted the body, ironically, out of his analysis of power, which is fixated on the body, and how psychoanalysis kept the analysis of sexuality closely tied to, say, the erogenous zones, like the hand and the mouth, and the actual operation of sexuality. So Foucault wants to respond to this objection. Here we need to distinguish between two questions. First, does the analysis of sexuality necessarily imply the elision of the body, anatomy, the biological, the functional? To this question, I think we can reply in the negative. In any case, the purpose of the present study is in fact to show how deployments of power are directly connected to the body, to bodies, functions, physiological processes, sensations, and pleasures. Far from the body having to be effaced, what is needed is to make it visible, through an analysis in which the biological and the historical are not consecutive to one another, as in the evolutionism of the first sociologists, but are bound together in an increasingly complex fashion in accordance with the development of the modern technologies of power that take life as their object. Hence, I do not envisage a history of mentalities that would take account of bodies only through the manner in which they have been perceived and given meaning and value, but a history of bodies, and the manner in which what is most material and most vital in them has been invested. I think what Foucault is saying here is that he is attempting to, through his analysis of power, actually show how power does make bodies visible, how power is able to make bodies open and pliable to be acted upon, to be comprehended. So he's not severing sexuality from the body, is his argument. What he's trying to do is to show how sexuality was actually a tool for power to begin to lay out and map and make sense of the body and how it could invest in the body. So actually, in a way, it's making the body even more material. I think that's what's going on here. So let's keep going, and if you have a different thought about it, please say something in the comments. Another question, distinct from the first one. This materiality that is referred to is not then that of sex, and it is not paradoxical to venture a history of sexuality at the level of bodies, without there being the least question of sex. After all, is the power that is exercised through sexuality not directed specifically at that element of reality, which is sex in general. That sexuality is not, in relation to power, an exterior domain to which power is applied. That, on the contrary, it is a result and an instrument of power's designs in all very well, is all very well. But as for sex, is it not the other with respect to power, while being the center around which sexuality distributes its effect? Now, it is precisely this idea of sex in itself that we cannot accept without examination. Is sex really the anchorage point that supports the manifestations of sexuality? Or is it not rather a complex idea that was formed inside the deployment of sexuality? In any case, one could show how this idea of sex took form in the different strategies of power and the definite role it played therein. So Foucault, in a way, is kind of putting the question back to the other person, and he's saying, hey, I'm not severing sexuality from the body, but what I am doing is I'm calling into question whether this thing called sex exists as kind of the mysterious core around which sexuality developed. In fact, he's kind of saying, I'm suspicious that this idea of sex was actually kind of generated as the inside of being acted upon by power's deployment of sexuality. So actually, the deployment of sexuality created the idea of sex, is what Foucault is trying to investigate. This is his hypothesis. So all along the great lines which the development of the deployment of sexuality has followed since the 19th century, one sees the elaboration of this idea that there exists something other than bodies, organs, somatic localizations, functions, anatomophysiological systems, sensations, and pleasures, something else and something more, with intrinsic properties and laws of its own, sex. Thus, in the process of hysterization of women, sex was defined in three ways: as that which belongs in common to men and women, as that which belongs par excellence to men, and hence is lacking in women, but at the same time as that which by itself constitutes women's body, ordering it wholly in terms of the functions of reproduction and keeping it in constant agitation through the effects of that very function. Hysteria was interpreted in this strategy as the movement of sex insofar as it was the one and the other, whole and part, principle and lack. Uh, he's pointing out is that he sees how this something else, something more, with intrinsic properties and laws of its own, sex. It's I think kind of where he's going with this is that the deployment of sexuality created this object called sex that power wanted to understand. That there's this sex is a law or a structure of nature underneath the sexually dimorphic human, and they want to analyze and define and understand the movements of that thing. In the sexualization of childhood, there was formed the idea of a sex that was both present and absent. Present, too, if one considered its activity, but deficient if one referred to its reproductive finality, or again, actual in its manifestations, but hidden in its eventual effects, whose pathological seriousness would only become apparent later. If the sex of the child was still present in the adult, it was in the form of a secret causality that tended to nullify the sex of the latter. It was one of the tenets of 18th and 19th century medicine that precocious sex would eventually result in sterility, impotence, frigidity, the inability to experience pleasure, or the deadening of the senses. By sexualizing childhood, the idea was established of a sex characterized essentially by the interplay of presence and absence, the visible and the hidden. Masturbation and the effects imputed to it were thought to reveal in a privileged way this interplay of presence and absence, of the visible and the hidden. In the psychiatrization of perversions, sex was related to biological functions and to an anatomophysiological machinery that gave it its meaning, that is, its finality, but it was also referred to an instinct, which through its peculiar development and according to the objects to which it could become attached, made it possible for perverse behavior patterns to arise and made their genesis intelligible. Thus, sex was defined by the interlacing of function and instinct, finality and signification. Moreover, this was the form in which it was manifested more clearly than anywhere else in the model perversion, in that fetishism, which from at least as early as 1877 served as the guiding thread for analyzing all the other deviations. In it one could clearly perceive the way in which the instinct became fastened to an object in accordance with an individual's historical adherence and biological inadequacy. Lastly, in the socialization of procreative behavior, sex was described as being caught between a law of reality, an economic necessity, being its most abrupt and immediate form, and an economy of pleasure, which was always attempting to circumvent that law, when, that is, it did not ignore it altogether. The most notorious frauds, coitus interruptus, represented the point where the insistence of the real forced an end to pleasure, and where the pleasure found a way to surface despite the economy dictated by the real. It is apparent that the deployment of sexuality, with its different strategies, was what established this notion of sex. And in the four major forms of hysteria, onanism, fetishism, and interrupted coition, it showed this sex to be governed by the interplay of whole and part, principle and lack, absence and presence, excess and deficiency, by the function of instinct, finality, and meaning of reality and pleasure. The theory thus generated performed a certain number of functions that made it indispensable. First, the notion of sex made it possible to group together in an artificial unity anatomical elements, biological functions, conduct, sensations, and pleasures. It enabled one to make use of this fictitious unity as a causal principle, an omnipresent meaning, a secret to be discovered everywhere. Sex was thus able to function as a unique signifier and as a universal signified. I think this confirms what I was saying earlier, basically that um, sex became this way of bringing together all of these different, as he points out, biological functions, but also social behaviors and even just individual pleasures. And it's posited this deep causal principle that power wants to understand in order to be able to manage, control, and invest. Um, Further, by presenting itself in a unitary fashion as anatomy and lack, as function and latency, as instinct and meaning, it was able to mark the line of contact between a knowledge of human sexuality and the biological sciences of reproduction. Thus, without really borrowing anything from the sciences, accepting a few doubtful analogies, the knowledge of sexuality gained through proximity, a guarantee of quasi-scientificity, but by virtue of this same proximity, some of the contents of biology and physiology were able to serve as a principle of normality for human sexuality. Finally, the notion of sex brought about a fundamental reversal. It made it possible to invert the representation of the relationships of power to sexuality, causing the latter to appear, not in its essential and positive relation to power, but as being rooted in a specific and irreducible urgency which power tries as best it can to dominate. Thus, the idea of sex makes it possible to evade what gives power its power. It enables one to conceive power solely as law and taboo. Sex, that agency which appears to dominate us, and that secret which seems to underlie all that we are, that point which enthralls us through the power it manifests and the meaning it conceals, in which we ask to reveal what we are and to free us from what defines us, is doubtless but an ideal point made necessary by the deployment of sexuality and its operation. This is the point of Foucault's first volume here. He's saying that this idea of sex as taboo and transgressive and as who we most deeply are is itself a trick of power. It's a trick where we're sort of playing cat and mouse. It's like a dog fight that we get into with power, where on the one hand we think that by digging up and expressing this underlying sex thing through our sexuality, we think that we're being transgressive and that we're able to get one over on power. But actually, this is precisely what power wants, because it wants us to draw that thing out. It wants to understand that entity, that fictional point that is implied by sexuality. So Foucault says we must not make the mistake of thinking that sex is an autonomous agency which secondarily produces manifold effects of sexuality over the entire length of its surface of contact with power. On the contrary, sex is the most speculative, most ideal, and most internal element in a deployment of sexuality organized by power, in its grip on bodies and their materiality, their forces, energies, sensations, and pleasures. He's saying that the deployment of sexuality by power is all in the service of the definition and goal of understanding this deep, mysterious core of sex. That power, it it has this vision of some internal principle that makes sex work, of like the vital energies of life, and it wants to understand them. And through the understanding of sexuality as the expression of sex, power slowly begins to accrue the information that it needs to begin to make sense of this very point that it has created, that it sees. It might be added that sex performs yet another function that runs through and sustains the one we have just examined. Its role in this instance is more practical than theoretical. It is through sex, in fact, an imaginary point determined by the deployment of sexuality that each individual has to pass in order to have access to his own intelligibility, seeing that it is both the hidden aspect and the generative principle of meaning, to the whole of his body, since it is real and a threatened part of it, while symbolically constituting the whole, to his identity, since it joins the force of a drive to the singularity of a history, through a reversal that doubtless had its surreptitious beginnings long ago. It was already making itself felt at the time of the Christian pastoral of the flesh. This is why the fourth volume of the History of Sexuality, which Foucault did not finish before he passed, is called Confessions of the Flesh and focuses on the Christian fascination with the flesh and the disciplining of the body. And of course, he talks about pastoral power elsewhere in his other lectures. I'll be getting into that in my lectures about his work and in the critical bureaucratic studies. But that the pastoral power and the fixation on the flesh, those are important themes for Foucault. We've arrived at the point where we expect our intelligibility to come from what was for many centuries thought of as a madness, the plenitude of our body, from what was long considered its stigma and likened to a wound, our identity from what was perceived as an obscure and nameless urge. What he's saying is that nowadays we derive our own personal meaning and self-concept, even access to our body, through this artificial idea of sex. When he's saying in the past, sex was considered a wound. I mean, the androgynous individual of Gnosticism and esoteric thought is sort of like pre-fall. The individual was androgynous, and the splitting of Adam and Eve is actually a part of the fall in some of these sort of older ways of thinking. So, and the feeling of lust or the desire to procreate that comes over us almost like a daemon, like this is how sex was perceived in the past. And to say sex was perceived this way is to not even have fully brought Foucault's thesis on board, because he's saying that they were not perceiving sex. He's saying that all of these various phenomena, which were seen as deeply problematic, wounding, like evidence of the world's degeneracy and fall, have all been gathered together under this single heading, this fictional point called sex. The importance we ascribe to it, the reverential fear with which we surround it, the care we take to know it. Hence the fact that over the centuries it has become more important than our soul, more important almost than our life. And so it is that all the world's enigmas appear frivolous to us compared to the secret, minuscule in each of us, but of a density that makes it more serious than any other. The Faustian pact, whose temptation has been instilled in us by the deployment of sexuality, is now as follows: to exchange life in its entirety for sex itself, for the truth and the sovereignty of sex. Sex is worth dying for. It is in this strictly historical sense that sex is indeed imbued with the death instinct. When a long while ago the West discovered love, it bestowed on it a value high enough to make death acceptable. Nowadays it is sex that claims this equivalence, the highest of all. And while the deployment of sexuality permits the techniques of power to invest life, the fictitious point of sex, itself marked by that deployment, exerts enough charm on everyone for them to accept hearing the grumble of death within it. By creating the imaginary element that is sex, the deployment of sexuality established one of its most essential internal operating principles, the desire for sex, the desire to have it, to access it, to discover it, to liberate it, to articulate in discourse, and to formulate it in truth. It constituted sex itself as something desirable. And it is this desirability of sex that attaches each one of us to the injunction to know it, to reveal its law and its power. It is this desirability that makes us think we are affirming the rights of our sex against all power, when in fact we are fastened to the deployment of sexuality that has lifted up from deep within us a sort of mirage in which we think we see ourselves reflected, the dark shimmer of sex. It is sex, said Kate in The Plumed Serpent. How wonderful sex can be, when men keep it powerful and sacred, and it fills the world like sunshine through and through one. So we must not refer a history of sexuality to the agency of sex, but rather show how sex is historically subordinate to sexuality. We must not place sex on the side of reality, and sexuality on that confused ideas and illusions. Sexuality is a very real historical formation. It is what gave rise to the notion of sex as a speculative element necessary to its operation. We must not think that by saying yes to sex, one says no to power. On the contrary, one tracks along the course laid out by the general deployment of sexuality. It is the agency of sex that we must break away from, if we aim, through a tactical reversal of the various mechanisms of sexuality, to counter the grips of power with the claims of bodies, pleasures, and knowledges, in their multiplicity and their possibility of resistance. The rallying point for the counterattack against the deployment of sexuality ought not to be sexual desire, but bodies and pleasures. We must not think that by saying yes to sex one says no to power. On the contrary, one tracks along the course laid out by the general deployment of sexuality. And again, we must not place sex on the side of reality and sexuality on that of confused ideas and illusions. Sexuality is a very real historical formation. It is what gave rise to the notion of sex as a speculative element necessary to its operation. A fascinating claim, one that I need to go into more deeply myself. As I just mentioned, I think about the esoteric thinkers who see sex as this fall from a pure androgynous state. I think this is what led back into the Greeks, into the Romans, into the Christians to begin to look at how one relates to one's body, their sensations, experiences prior to their sexualization, i.e. being brought under the general heading of something called sex. There has never been so much action in the past, said D.H. Lawrence, especially sexual action. A wearying repetition over and over without a corresponding thought, a corresponding realization. Now our business is to realize sex. Today, the full conscious realization of sex is even more important than the act itself. Perhaps one day people will wonder at this. They will not be able to understand how a civilization so intent on developing enormous instruments of production and destruction found the time and the infinite patience to inquire so anxiously concerning the actual state of sex. People will smile, perhaps, when they recall that here were men, meaning ourselves, who believed that therein resided a truth every bit as precious as the one they had already demanded from the earth, the stars, and the pure forms of their thought. People will be surprised at the eagerness with which we went about pretending to rouse from its slumber a sexuality which everything, our discourses, our customs, our institutions, our regulations, our knowledge, was busy producing in the light of day and broadcasting to noisy accompaniment. And people will ask themselves why we were so bent on ending the rule of silence regarding what was the noisiest of our preoccupations. Foucault, in this line, is saying, how can we pretend that sex is transgressive and somehow subject to stigma and taboo when it is the thing that we talk about more than anything else? Which is how he opens the book. He notes that today people are still trying to maintain this idea that sex is repressed, when in reality, we as a civilization have written and said more and thought about it and pictured it more than any other group of humans in human history have ever talked about it. In retrospect, this noise may appear to have been out of place, But how much stranger will seem our persistence in interpreting it as but the refusal to speak in the order to remain silent. People will wonder what could have made us so presumptuous. They will look for the reasons that might explain why we prided ourselves on being the first to grant sex the importance we say is its due, and how we come to congratulate ourselves for finally, in the 20th century, having broken free of a long period of harsh repression, a protracted Christian asceticism, greedily and fastidiously adapted to the imperatives of bourgeois economy, and what we now perceive as the chronicle of a censorship and the difficult struggle to remove it will be seen rather as the centuries-long rise of a complex deployment for compelling sex to speak, for fastening our attention and concern upon sex, for getting us to believe in the sovereignty of its law, when in fact we were moved by the power mechanisms of sexuality. People will be amused at the reproach of pansexualism that was once aimed at Freud and psychoanalysis. But the ones who will appear to have been blind will perhaps be not so much those who formulated the objection as those who discounted it out of hand, as if it merely expressed the fears of an outmoded prudishness. For the first, after all, were only taken unawares by a process which had begun long before, and by which, unbeknown to them, they were already surrounded on all sides. What they had attributed solely to the genius of Freud had already gone through a long stage of preparation. They had gotten their dates wrong as to the establishment, in our society, of a general deployment of sexuality. But the others were mistaken concerning the nature of the process. They believed that Freud had, at last, through a sudden reversal, restored to sex the rightful share which had been denied for so long. They had not seen how the good genius of Freud had placed it at one of the critical points marked out for it since the 18th century by the strategies of knowledge and power. How wonderfully effective he was, worthy of the greatest spiritual fathers and directors of the classical period, in giving a new impetus to the secular injunction to study sex and transform it into discourses. We are often reminded of the countless procedures which Christianity once deployed to make us detest the body. But let us ponder all the ruses that were employed for centuries to make us love sex, to make the knowledge of it desirable, and everything said about it precious. Let us consider the stratagems by which we were induced to apply all our skills to discovering its secrets, by which we were attached to the obligation to draw out its truth, and made guilty for having failed to recognize it for so long. These devices are what ought to make us wonder today. Moreover, we need to consider the possibility that one day, perhaps in a different economy of bodies and pleasures, people will no longer quite understand how the ruses of sexuality and the power that sustains its organization were able to subject us to that austere monarchy of sex, so that we became dedicated to the endless task of forcing its secret, of exacting the truest of confessions from a shadow. The irony of this deployment is in having us believe that our liberation is in the balance. Ladies and gentlemen, The Right of Death and Power Over Life, written by Michel Foucault. In this final line here, the irony of this deployment is in having us believe that our liberation is in the balance. We see why Foucault is such a complicated figure for the left. Because Foucault saw in the left's continual demand for health and life and rights and for sexual liberation, he began to see in those demands the internal effect of power's operation. He began to see how those things which are portrayed as liberating, as those things that are postured as coming unrepressed, that this was not the liberating act that many believed it to be. This is a core part of understanding what Foucault is doing, why he is so valuable for political theory, because he's not simply an affirmation of present leftist discourse. Of course, he's also not on the conservative right here. He doesn't fit anywhere comfortably he sees how liberation does not necessarily always bring what it seems to promise. And that liberation is almost like kind of the internal deceptive discourse of power itself. This, of course, makes the idea of freedom and liberation extremely complicated. But, of course, I think everything is at stake on freedom. And so we need to think with Foucault about how we cannot approach freedom and liberation in exactly the way that it has been approached in the past. I mean, really, since the 18th century, Foucault is really describing here. We cannot approach it in that way because by doing so, we fall prey to power's devices in putting our vital energies, in putting our life at its disposal for control and for management. I hope that you will consider signing up for my course. I will have more information once it's available. I will be piloting a mini version sometime in March of 2025, and then hopefully middle or end of the rest of the year, I'll be able to launch a larger version. And this text right here is going to be a core part of that course. I'm also working through security, territory, population, which is an incredibly rich set of lectures from Foucault that I think are complementary to this text as well. My research is ongoing, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you all eventually. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.